I think right now, Flea Mortals is one of the monster manuals most worthy of discussion and serious examination. It's a very ambitious book, meant to totally replace the core 5e monsters by transforming each monster into a unique tactical threat. In its sort of mission statement, it says that it wants to transform monsters into more than just a bag of hit points. On the face of it, it was massively successful, raising over $2 million in its Kickstarter and receiving near universally glowing praise in reviews. However, in this praise, I think a lot of the wrinkles in this book are being ignored. So as I review Flea Mortals, I want to explore how it evolves tactical play, but how this evolution comes at the expense of a fully realized role-playing experience. This book has a lot going on, and I don't think I can cover everything. So we will focus on the design of their standard monsters, the bosses, or as they call them, action-based monsters, retainers, and rival parties. Additionally, I'll be comparing MCDM's approach to monster design with that of another book which has a very different perspective on how to create interesting and evocative monsters. Additionally, to manage the scope of this book, I'll be focusing on a few specific monsters and chapters that I think are exemplary of MCDM's design philosophy. I want to start by looking at the Flea Mortals' Goblin chapter. I want to start with this one because in all of their sample materials and in all of their promo stuff, this is the one that they share and focus on. So when MCDM puts their strongest foot first, they choose to show off their Goblin chapter. The Goblin chapter starts off with some light backstory, advice on how to run them, a brief description of what creatures have a symbiotic relationship with the goblins, along with the goblin boss, Queen Bargnath. The intro highlights that they are encountered in groups, they are mobile and sneaky, and that their magic comes from pacts with evil entities. Where these bits of information come together is that they show that goblins are highly mobile threats, which rely on coordination to execute hit-and-run attacks on their enemies. This information helps contextualize the different goblin types in this chapter because it tells me that when I'm reading the stat blocks, I should be thinking about how they come together to perform highly coordinated hit-and-run ambushes against their enemies. There's also some light background and lore, but I don't find it particularly helpful for running goblins. And I'll get to a lot of my issues with how this book handles the kind of backstory and lore later. Now, moving on to the real meat of Flea Mortals. The individual monsters themselves. The foundation of monster design in Flea Mortals is a combination of two aspects. One is theme, and the other is role. Theme is creature types such as goblin, human, and orc. Importantly, this theme can include creatures that either work with or have a symbiotic relationship with the creatures. For example, the Goblin chapter has little bat-like rat creatures which can help and work with the goblins. They additionally have a giant war spider which the goblins use in combat. So while it's not a goblin, it is something that is used in goblin-themed encounters. And role describes how an individual monster type fits within that theme during combat. For example, it has roles like Skirmisher, Brute, and Controller. This means that unlike the 5e monster manuals that have two types of goblin, normal goblin and the kind of big goblin, Flea Mortals provides a variety of goblins, each filling their own combat role, like a goblin ambusher or a goblin controller. Each theme is given mechanical cohesion through a shared unique ability. For example, goblins have the Crafty ability. Creatures with Crafty don't provoke attacks of opportunity when exiting an enemy's reach. The result of this is that in any given encounter, the players will be at a mobility disadvantage against the goblins, since the goblins can freely reposition themselves in combat without giving the players attacks of opportunity. This helps make goblins mechanically and thematically cohesive as a monster type, because in each encounter, there is a shared tactical problem the players have to solve. Now, in order to understand how theme and its combination with role makes each monster a unique threat, let's take a look at the Goblin Assassin and the Goblin Spine Cleaver. The Goblin Assassin is the combination between the Goblin theme and the Ambusher role. Its defining abilities are Backstab and Summon Shadows. Backstab grants an extra burst of damage when the Goblin Assassin makes an attack with advantage. Additionally, when the attack hits, it grants an extra d6 of bleeding damage against the foe. Summon Shadows is a once-a-day ability that the Goblin can use to create a zone of darkness that only it can see through. Lastly, the Goblin Assassin can hide as a bonus action rather than using a full action to hide. Where these abilities come together is that it makes it very good at quickly striking unsuspecting foes, dealing bursts of damage, and then using its Summon Shadows and Hide abilities, come out of combat and prepare for another devastating burst of damage against the players. Here, Crafty is primarily used as a defensive tool meant to help it extract from difficult and thorny combats where it could be quickly focused down and killed by the players. The Goblin Spine Cleaver is the combination between the Goblin theme and the Brute role. Its defining traits are its Strong Grip and Tricksy Warrior abilities. Strong Grip allows the Goblin Spine Cleavers to wield larger weapons than other small creatures normally would be able to. What this functionally means is that in combat, the Goblin Spine Cleaver can do a whole lot more damage than other goblins. The Tricksy Warrior ability allows the Goblin Spine Cleaver to use their reaction to attack an enemy that previously missed an attack against it. Where these abilities come together is that the Spine Cleaver is a strong frontline threat. It is meant to dive directly into the middle of action and draw attention quickly. Here, its Crafty ability is mainly offensive, as it allows the Spine Cleaver to dive directly in the middle of a fight and pursue fleeing enemies without giving the players a chance to react when making attacks of opportunity. With the Spine Cleaver and Goblin Assassin together, I think we can have a pretty clear idea of how they can work together in a fight. The Spine Cleaver, of course, would initiate by diving into the middle of action, drawing the player's attention. And then the assassins would come in, flank the players, and then do massive bursts of damage before retreating, forcing the players to choose between dealing with the Spine Cleaver, who is currently in their face, or trying to pursue the assassins, while the assassins are retreating and preparing their next attack. Here, we can see the strength of Flea Mortal's design foundation. The combination between theme and role creates a wide variety of monsters, each having an intuitive, tactical role that causes them to be more than just the sum of their parts when encountered together. Due to the diversity created with this method, no two combats are the same. A fight against a Spine Cleaver and a few assassins is very different from a fight against a Goblin Curse Spitter and a few Goblin Warriors. And yet, because they are under the same theme of Goblin and are tied together with the Tricksy Warrior ability, there is still a sense of unity among all Goblin encounters through their shared mobility. This results in tactical play offered by Flea Mortals feeling pretty well developed, going far above and beyond what the core 5e Monster Manual or any of the official Wizards of the Coast D&D products has to offer. Now, my favorite new mechanic or tool introduced in this book is the action-based monster. Action-based monsters are bosses who have special abilities called villainous actions. Villainous actions are meant to replace the legendary actions that bosses in D&D get by giving them something really interesting and unique to do, rather than either just cast a spell or make an extra attack. Villainous actions come in sets of 3, and while they can technically be used in any order, they're really meant to be used from first to third, and each one can only be used once in the fight. Like legendary actions, they are activated at the end of a player's turn. To see how they work, let's take a look at Queen Bargnot, the goblin boss monster that's included in Flea Mortals. The first villain action is really meant to be a sort of opener. It sets the tone for the fight and shows the players what they're in for. For Bargnot, her first action is titled, "What Are You Waiting For?" When she uses this ability, each ally within 60 feet of her can move up to their normal speed and make a melee attack. What this ability does is act as a sort of ambush at the beginning of the fight. As even if the players all go first in turn order, Bargnot can still use her legendary action to functionally give all of her allies and minions a whole extra turn at the start of the fight. The second villain action is meant to act as a bit of crowd control. It is meant to give the boss the upper hand in the middle of the fight and stop it from totally turning against them. For Queen Bargnot, her second action is Focus Fire. When activating this ability, she chooses an enemy that she can see, and each of her allies may move their speed towards that enemy. This gives Bargnot the upper hand in combat because it puts one of the player characters in serious jeopardy, as she could functionally surround them with her minions, forcing forcing them to choose between either bailing their friend out and trying to focus on Queen Bargnot and win the fight. The third and final villainous action acts as a sort of ultimate. It is a desperate finishing move that puts the players on the back foot at the end of a fight. For Queen Bargnot, this ability is Kill. What Kill does is it makes each of her allies make an additional weapon attack with advantage. And if this attack hits, it deals an extra d6 damage. This rapid burst of damage against the players forces them to choose between trying to race the goblins for damage and try to kill them first, or pull back and lick their wounds. There are two main impacts that the villainous actions have on a boss fight. The first is that they keep tension in a fight high, as each villainous action shuffles the board and poses new problems for the players to solve, keeping the fight dynamic and preventing it from being a sort of stagnant slog. The second is that the villain action creates a sort of three-act structure in the fight, with each action marking a new phase defined by the tactical problem that it causes. This sort of act structure results in an implied narrative for the fight, turning it from a tactical combat puzzle into a story. These two aspects of villain actions come together to make boss fights much more interesting and much more memorable for the players. This is a mechanic that I wholeheartedly condone stealing and adding to your home game, almost regardless of the system that you are running, so long as the fights are long enough to sort of warrant the three-act structure that the villain actions create. Ultimately, with this aspect of the book, I think that MCDM has done a really great job. Lastly, Flee Mortals adds allied monsters in the form of retainers and companions. Retainers being sapient, conscious creatures like humans, tieflings, or elves, and companions being animal pets. These allied monsters are generally expected to stay with the party for an extended period of time. As they level up, they gain abilities, hit points, and proficiency bonuses alongside the players. By mechanically growing in power with the party, they continue to be useful as the party's power level increases. Their continued usefulness encourages the players to keep them around from session to session. By mechanically growing in power with the party, they continue to be useful in fights while the power level of combat escalates. Their continued usefulness encourages the players to keep them around between multiple sessions or even campaign arcs, giving the party time to form a meaningful relationship with their retainer or companion. This is in stark contrast with a lot of original D&D or OSR style play, where companions are often functional meat bags that are used to throw at the problems the players are facing, either as fodder for traps or as literal meat shields for the angry pack of goblins that are attacking them. However, there are some issues that undercut companions and retainers from being fully realized and interesting characters that I will get to later in this review. So, while it is clear that Flee Mortals improves on the 5e monsters by making them tactically interesting and adding variety within themes or monster types, the major weakness of Flee Mortals is baked into its strength: high investment into stat block focused monster design. Since Flee Mortal focuses all of its design, effort, and focus on how a monster behaves in combat, or the things that are on the stat block, other aspects fall to the wayside. The result of this is that while each monster is tactically interesting, they don't have much of a personality beyond their theme and how they behave in combat. This significantly damages the ability to offer deep monsters and interesting campaign-defining threats, along with their ability for retainers to stand out, along with the ability for rival parties to really be meaningful rival parties. Let's start with how the stat block-focused monster design fails to offer interesting characterization to monsters. To do this, I'll be comparing the goblins from Flee Mortals to the goblins in the Dolmen Wood Monster Manual. Dolmen Wood is a campaign setting inspired by British folklore, which spans between multiple books: a player's book, a campaign setting book, and a monster manual. We will only be focusing on the latter today because it's the only part that's really relevant to this. Dolmen Wood sets up their monsters with a quick description. In the case of the goblins, it is that they are blue-skinned fey merchants and charlatans who ferry goods from the land of fairy to trade in Dolmen Wood. They have a deep love for material wealth, rivaling that of humans. It has a stat block which highlights its behavior and speech, being that they are sly, tricksy, and craven. They have whimsical, and they engage in animated banter when talking. Moving down to their abilities and features, they have an ability which allows them to sell illusory goods which evaporate an hour after they're purchased. They can magically steal items from their owners, and if a goblin is invited into a house, they are bound by an ancient rite of hospitality. Lastly, there is a table with quirks that can make individual goblins somewhat unique, and an encounter table. The quirks that differentiate the goblins in Dolmenwood don't go nearly as far as Flee Mortals to add variety to goblins. However, the encounters that Dolmenwood offer are pretty interesting. The first encounter is that the party will see the goblins crowded around a golden-haired maiden in a glade. They're proffering her syrupy fairy fruits upon bronze platters. Her sister peeks out from behind a nearby boulder, fearful of approaching the fairies. The second encounter is that the players will see the goblins arguing with a pack of scabies, and they're arguing over a sack of a Sklubber's Twist the scabies have for sale. The goblins wish to trade it for a trio of dewy peaches. The third is that they will see a goblin hastening away from an old woman who they have duped with illusory trinkets of fairy silver. The fourth is that the players will see goblins prancing around a gel to jaunty pipe music, playfully tossing a human baby into the air. The goblin entry in Dolmenwood comes together to build up the monster's characterization, as it tells me as a GM specifically how they act, what they want, how they get what they want, and how they relate to the rest of the world. All of the specificities that Dolmenwood includes create the clear image of a creature who uses trickery and subterfuge to get gold and wealth, but is still nuanced as it follows codes of hospitality, and it is not necessarily inherently threatening or hostile. And at times, it can even be helpful, as it can trade strange and otherworldly goods from the land of fairy that the players normally wouldn't be able to get in the mundane realm. Here, goblins are more than just green bandits who the players are guaranteed to fight. They're fully formed characters that can prompt interesting and meaningful interactions with the players. Monsters like this encourage role-playing in role-playing games. Meanwhile, the extra stat block information that Flee Mortals gives is vague, writing, like all humanoid ancestries, there are many different goblins and goblin cultures, each with their own ideas, and they can be found in every environment humans occupy and places that many avoid, like deep cave systems. By saying they believe in all sorts of things and live in all sorts of places, Flee Mortals fails to build interesting information into the goblin's character, as it's not clear how they act interpersonally or the sort of things they value. It does talk about their society, but only mentioning that they are communal. The vagueness of their descriptions is in sharp contrast with their highly detailed stat blocks. And while the book makes allusions to goblin society and diversity among beliefs, if the only developed way to interact with them is through combat, then they are little more than small green bandits. And as a monster, that's not very compelling. Even the named goblin, Queen Bargnot, is basically just a bandit with little to no flourishes besides her combat mechanics. This results in goblins that are certainly interesting to fight, but they're not really interesting to do much else with. Flee Mortals sells their dragons as ancient, campaign-defining monsters who hold millennium-long grudges and carry massive power. Each of the dragons will prove difficult encounters, with powers that require strategic thinking to overcome. However, what makes a great campaign-defining enemy is not found within the stat block directly. Rather, it is their ability to significantly impact the players and the world around them. They should shape the plot, the action, and the mere existence should be a threat that's felt globally. While some vague motivations are noted in the descriptions of each dragon, there are no notes on how they impact the world around them, and there is no indication for their methods of getting what they want. It's hard to consider something meaningfully campaign-defining if it's just a cool combat encounter confined to a stat block and a brief descriptive paragraph. I want to know how Kazeldrath, the Sun Eater, returning from a millennium of sleep, would impact the world as it slowly begins to wake. I want some omens to toss on my level 1 players that foreshadow its return. I want some negative mechanical effects so that my players can feel its oppressive presence in the process of gameplay. I want to know what its minions want from a millennium-long darkness. It is these pre-fight interactions between the players and the campaign boss, which build up emotional investment and characterization over time. If how I relate to a boss is just through combat, then in my memory, the boss fight is going to be cataloged with all the other combat encounters I've done. But if the monster's presence is foreshadowed, if its minions are making it difficult for me to complete my goals, if it's slowly eating the sun is causing problems because it's plunging the world into darkness, then I will be building up a memorable relationship with the monster, and I will be strongly motivated to fight and kill it. Without tools to start forming the relationship with this monster throughout the campaign, the promised campaign-defining boss feels incomplete. While I don't expect a full campaign setting or blueprint and a monster manual, having a small list of potential allies and increasingly devastating world-spanning effects would go a long way to make these dragons much more interesting and really feel like great apocalyptic monsters. Problems with campaign-defining enemies are mirrored in the problems with retainers. While they have mechanical bonuses in combat, they lack any other sort of detail. No indication of the sort of payment they want or conditions they require to work for the crew, no notes on personality, and they have no real non-combat skills. Again, if I'm going to have a companion be with my party for a good chunk of a campaign, I expect that the monster would add some interesting utility. For example, if I have a goblin join the party, it would be really useful if it had some cultural or linguistic knowledge, or if it was a particularly good scout. However, since its abilities are confined to combat as they are written, these retainers are a little more than additional fighting units the players have to control in the middle of the fight. The progression gives a lot of staying power, and this is great. But despite this, there's little capacity or framework to make them really interesting characters and to really realize their potential as meaningful campaign companions for the players. Where I would like to end my critique of Flee Mortals is with the evil or rival parties. Generally speaking, I'm a really big fan of rival parties. If the players have a force constantly competing against them throughout the campaign and constantly trying to undermine them, it makes the game way more interesting, as they have an antagonist whose frequent contact creates room to form a relationship. However, like the dragon, what makes a really good campaign threat versus what makes a really good combat encounter are not the same thing, which, as we will see, is reflected in the villainous parties. In setting up these parties, MCDM highlights that they are comically evil. Optimized to be fought at a certain level, they have party actions which are similar to villainous actions but are shared amongst the whole party and not just one specific character. And most importantly, MCDM highlights that the lead up to fighting these parties should be a slow burn, which includes contact with the villainous party to motivate the players to fight them. To understand the weakness of MCDM's approach here, I will be focusing on the Black Iron Pact. The Black Iron Pact is a conspiracy of elite human supremacists who want to take over the city for their god. One of the most important aspects of a rival party is how they attempt to harm and sabotage the player characters in order to get ahead in their goal. The methods and tactics that are given by the Black Iron Pact are use of a secret clubhouse they can teleport to, they bring overwhelming numbers to a fight, and they prefer ambushes. Additionally, while not explicitly stated in their methods, one member is an assassin that goes after their enemies, and another has a reputation for throwing people out of a mage's college. These bits of intro are fine, but are not nearly enough to form a strategic profile for the villainous party. Besides outright assault, there are no suggested tactics for how they cause problems for the party. As a faction based on the idea of a shadowy cabal, I would at least like a handful of suggestions for how they could use their power and connections to sabotage the players, such as putting a price on their head, banning them from trading weapons, framing them for a crime, banning them from the mage's college, and so on. The flavor mismatch continues on their magic items, which are a ring which teleports them to their clubhouse. Ironically, this is mainly used to extract from a fight if it's turning against them. And the other one is the Star of Iron, a hammer which nerfs whoever it strikes. Their items don't help them gather information, manipulate people, or engage in subterfuge. Rather, they mostly exist for combat utility. This results in the Black Iron Pact and the other evil parties feeling unfinished, because how the evil party is a threat outside of combat and how they interact with the players when not fighting is nearly totally underdeveloped, and yet it is the most important thing for rival parties to get right. Flee Mortals offers a number of great stat blocks. It tactically transforms a lot of monsters from 5e into interesting puzzle pieces for combat rather than bland training dummies. It is really much better than the core 5e monster manual, but at the same time, it misses the mark with what makes monsters interesting. A key phrase brought up in the book and by the MCDM crew is making monsters more than just about hit points. But I think it fails to do this because the monsters that exist in this book are ultimately just receptacles and providers of violence, limiting their existence to pre-planned combat encounters. Ultimately, the result of this is, while it's a massive 400 pages, it feels incomplete because the characterization and roleplay utility of these monsters is shallow and often near non-existent. And while they do offer some information about these monsters, it is in the form of combat strategies and some light background lore rather than concrete bits of characterization that I can use when running the game. While working with monsters in the future, I think it's really important to embrace the tactical side of role-playing games. But this should never come at the expense of role-playing in role-playing games. And should you give the book a read? Yeah, especially if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Its tactical approach is more or less done right, and it has some really good ideas that you should add to your campaign. But don't expect this to do anything close than be the only monster manual you need. And with each of these monsters, you will need to do a lot of work as the DM to actually make them interesting and to fully realize their potential.